Hey everyone, Cody Menz here with a preview video for the upcoming Tier 9 Swedish tank destroyer, which is currently a reward tank, but they could change prior to releasing, and they could change it into a premium or keep it as a reward. It's called I'm going to botch the name here, the Lätt Stridsfordon, I think is the full name, or Lätt Stridsfordon 120. I think translates to light combat vehicle, if I'm not mistaken. I'm sure someone will correct me in the YouTube comments here if I'm wrong, which I probably am. But in any event, this tank, according to what Wargaming has in the client here, in the 1970s, so a fairly modern tank, Swedish engineers developed several original projects, among which was the Lätt Stridsfordon 120. The Bofors engineers meant for it to become a lighter version of the Strev 103, which we kind of already have in the game, and the project was meant to build essentially a turretless 20-ton tank with the ability to elevate and depress the gun with siege mode as we know it in World of Tanks. And sometime later, the military made the final choice in favor of the vehicles with fully rotating turrets instead of the Lätt Stridsfordon project, and it essentially was only a blueprint. Now, this tank, to sum up what this tank is, compared to the Strev 1030 at Tier 9, this is essentially a Tier 9 version of the Tier 8 UDES 3, which is the tech tree version in the Swedish tank destroyer line. This essentially less armor and is meant to kind of be a lighter version, more or less. Now, stat-wise, is this thing going to be good? Is it going to be bad? Who knows if they're going to keep things exactly the same from what you see here, but we're going to go over a little bit, and I think this tank is fairly close to what they're going to release it as, because it looks in a pretty good spot, in my opinion. And it could potentially be, I guess, 2024's a Battle Pass tank, would be my guess, because unless they change it into essentially like a premium tank, there's not too many more avenues for them to release this, because they already announced, for Onslaught mode, the Tier 10 Hurricane, which is a CS63, so there's not really too many, I feel like, avenues for them to release, a tank like this, but maybe they'll surprise us. Now, or I guess before we get into the comparison here, armor-wise, is this thing good armor-wise? As I mentioned, it being close to an UDES 3, not really. This thing, more or less, is 40 millimeters with little bits of 20 millimeters. So the upper glacis is entirely dependent on your angle. You can get it in siege mode, the 40 millimeter bits essentially at auto bounce angles. But if something's going to overmatch you, it's going to pen you. Which, being at Tier 9, a lot of guns can do that against 40 millimeters. Now, statistically, two closest tanks, I threw in Tier 9 Strev 1030, and then even the Tier 8 UDES. Just for comparison sakes, I'm mainly going to be focusing on the Tier 9 though. This tank, I feel like, is very much just the UDES 3 kind of souped up. Kind of more petite, but souped up for Tier 9. This does have a 420 damage gun, which is different, obviously, than these two tanks. And 290 millimeters of pen is a bit less, than the Strev 1030 here at Tier 9. Now, the interesting thing is, so this tank does have a premium heat round, which has 330 millimeters of pen, pretty decent shell velocity at 1100, and that's compared to the APCR round, that the Strev 1030 has. So I consider that kind of a bonus, because it's nice to have a standard like APCR round and a premium heat for two different shell types. And even like the Tier 8 UDES doesn't have that. So that's one kind of selling feature so far. This has slightly higher alpha, I feel like better ammunition options. And then as far as the penetration, like, it does take a little bit of a hit there, but I don't feel like it's the end of the world having a little bit less pen, because sometimes it can be a little overkill. Or I guess it's not overkill if you pen, because that's great, but you know what I mean. Now, the gun depression here, this essentially, just using the World of Tanks, comparison tool here, -14, it's better than the Strev, and like the UDES kind of like backs up a little bit differently. So it's something to keep in mind, to where basically, in my opinion, it's good. It's going to be able to hold down. But the one thing to note, so like when you're going into siege mode, looking at these stats here, this does have less DPM than the Strub 1030, at least for now. So going into siege mode, if I can pull up, so tanks.gg here, and I'll put a link to this in the description as well. Just got to get my correct Chrome tab here. So when it comes down to this, and we're just gonna make sure this is right. So being within siege mode, this tank actually has more DPM than the tier 9 Strub 1030. So like currently in game, outside of siege mode, this thing has 2100 900 base compared to the Strub 103 at 28 38, which, you know, as you see here, is essentially the same within. But the one thing to point out, which I'm pretty sure I have this, yeah, so I do have this set up correctly. So that's pretty big, you know, seeing that this thing, while in siege mode, is actually pretty comparable to the tier 9 DPM wise. The rate of fire goes up to 6.8, whereas currently outside of siege mode is 5.22. And then going down to the dispersion, you do still have worse accuracy, so 0.34 on the lot Struff, I'm just going to say, versus outside of siege mode, you have 0.39. And then it is much worse compared to the Strub 1030 at 0.29 within siege mode, which is pretty laser accurate. So it is something to keep in mind to this tank. So it does sacrifice a bit of accuracy. However, pretty much within siege mode, the DPM does come up to the Strub 1030 values, just off of like the base stats with no equipment or anything involved. So that is something to kind of keep noted, because that's something to where if you're just looking at the tanks outside of siege mode, you might not always, you know, you won't notice that basically. So with that in mind, you know, the DPM, like, you're rarely shooting outside of siege mode, so I feel like that's definitely a nice thing to know. One thing is, so looking at the tank outside of siege mode, so the gun is similar to the UDES 3, if you're looking at kind of the design of it, where it does kind of traverse up and down differently than the Strub 1030, which is more locked in place. So it is a different tank design and closer to the UDES 3. So the tanks are going to perform a bit differently and feel differently when it comes to like how the gun works. But it's nice to see that DPM wise in siege mode, the tank is basically on par with the Strev, just a lot less accurate, which is, you know, pretty huge for how these tanks are going to be playing. Hit points, same. Armor, I would give it to the Strub 1030. This tank I feel like has the worst armor. And you can overmatch a lot easier given the weaker sides. And there's little bits in your upper glacis armor that are less than 40 millimeters. Now, one important thing, so mobility. These things aren't as fast as the UDES 3, which is really, really zippy. But this thing is a little bit faster, you know, especially going forward. 60 kilometers an hour versus 50. Specific power is pretty same though. It does have a really weak engine, you know, so it's a little bit different in that regard because this is a lighter tank. But it is nice to see mobility-wise the thing does have a little bit of edge over the Strev. Entering exit siege mode, same for these two. It is better than, say, the UDES, a tier lower. And camouflage, it is a little bit better than the Strub 1030, camouflage-wise, with identical view range. Now, overall, is this tank gonna be, I guess, worth it performance-wise? I feel like this tank, more than most, is very cut or dry, to where you either like Swedish tank destroyers or you absolutely hate them. Statistically, I think this tank, I don't think they really need to make any changes because I feel like it has its own strengths and weaknesses versus the Strv 1030, and being a reward tank, I think it would actually make a pretty good tank, you know, whether it's for a special event or for the battle pass, because I don't think it's too good. It's not bad. It's just on par and a little bit different than the current tech tree tank, which I think is really good for a reward tank to be. When it comes out though, like, is it worth kind of rushing to get? It really depends on if you like this type of tank. You don't see too many Swedish tank destroyers out there because they are very specific in their role, and they're very map dependent and team dependent. But I think this tank, personally, I really like the UDES 3 because the mobility and kind of camo is kind of nice, to where sometimes like the Strv 103, 0, and even 103B sometimes, like, it definitely, they feel a little bit different. Whereas this, while it's not like you're running around like an E25, like scouting and stuff at tier 7, it feels like you have a little bit more flexibility in this, and especially with how the gun is mounted. So it'll be interesting to see when they bring this out, but I think when it does, it'll perform as expected, and it won't really let you down performance-wise. It's more or less, you know, do you like this type of tank? In any event though, hopefully you enjoyed this video. I hope I didn't botch the name too much and people aren't angry at me. And I guess we'll wait to see when Wargaming decides to bring this out at some point in, you know, 2023 or 2024. I guess we'll just have to wait and see. Thanks again, and I'll see you in another video sometime soon. Have a good one.